Hello and welcome to the Prison Pod. We are in middle of season four, and I'm so glad to have a great guest again today. We have Nico Cuevas Quiles joining us, and we're going to talk about alternative dispute resolution, probably in a multitude of other questions and topics too, but that's where I think we're probably going to start out. So, hi Nico, how are you today?
Great. Thanks for having me, Valerie. Appreciate your time today.
I was really interested in the topic of the conflict resolution and alternatives to that because I have a great interest in restorative justice, and I find that a lot of alternatives work better than the old tried and true programs that are sometimes used. So I really look forward to what you have to say on that.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm definitely here to provide that as a resource and a lot of information. As you know, I'm a fan of the alternative dispute resolution process myself, being a practitioner.
So now, what is your actual job that you do?
Yeah, I mean, so the role of mediation, of course, unlike attorneys, is a collaborative process, right? It's encouraged to be what they call an interest-based resolution model as opposed to the litigious side, which is considered to be what they refer to as positional in the legal industry. You know, mediators are what they refer to as collaborative, not adversarial. And so the process is really to encourage two parties or more that are in dispute to understand that they're the first and last line of defense in solving an issue or resolving conflict.
So, are there different types of mediators for different types of problems and conflicts?
Yeah, I think the neat thing about mediation, and again, much like traditional attorney representation, is that it's a very broad scope of an area of practice. To your point, there are mediators that have specialties, right? So, for instance, my wife and I, we have a son who's autistic, and I've done a lot of work in the neurodivergent space as a mediator and facilitator. There are mediators that specialize, like myself, specifically in business intermediary work. So when you're talking about companies from startup to mature companies that are experiencing conflict within the workplace or workforce, maybe within their dynamic structures of corporate culture, things that have been implemented or removed, partnership disputes. So there are a lot of different areas of practice and focus. Traditionally, what ends up happening is, of course, most mediators kind of cut their teeth in the world of family and divorce law. That's traditionally a space that, of course, has a lot of conflict given the sensitivity of parenting and parenting choices. And so, a lot of times, mediators will come in, and if you're stepping into that realm of professional expertise, you'll sit down in mediations when you're invited through family law disputes.
I'm curious if you've done any mediation with people who are incarcerated who are at risk of losing their parental rights.
Yes, and in fact, traditionally, that's a scope of conversation that's actually quite frequented in the space of the criminal justice system. To your point about the question, absolutely. So I've facilitated disputes between parents that are incarcerated that maybe were facing the prospects of losing their rights as custodial parents. Typically, for instance, here in Wisconsin, it's presumed that the best interest of the child is to have mom and dad, right, share in the legal capacity and responsibility of raising the child. So you would have the joint legal position, but placement might be different. A lot of times when someone is incarcerated, the courts tend to move only when it's almost requested by the other parent, right? There might be some other dynamics there that are impacting the parental relationship. Conversely, of course, the other side of the story is the incarcerated parent that has maintained a quality relationship with the child prior to being impacted, and then they would move to challenge that particular dispute in court.
That's great. So what is different between what you do and what a lawyer would do?
Well, traditionally, what you have is that, mediation or the process of dispute resolution is really meant to address a grievance, right? A grievance that one intends to empower individuals rather than punish individuals in solving the issue. I had mentioned that an attorney is very positional, right? Valerie's right. I'm her attorney. And Nico, you're wrong. And by the way, so is your attorney. So that's the positional argumentation. And when you think about it, right, attorneys are supposed to be positional, right? They're supposed to come in. That's why they're called opening arguments. You never hear of anything related to opening dialogue in a court system. Again, unlike legal proceedings, mediation is meant to be collaborative and not adversarial. And so you're encouraging the solution. You're serving as that intermediary, right? A facilitator, if you will, facilitating the conversations. I always like to tell clients we don't deal with the what ifs, we like to deal with the what is. And so when you start having those conversations with individuals that they believe, right? One side believes it's this is the issue to the point of family court, right? Husband and wife walking into the courtroom. One has a high profile, high powered attorney law firm. The other person walks in with, run of the mill, maybe representation as far as their attorney. And once the judge sees everybody walk in, the first thing the judge is going to order in a divorce proceeding is a mediation, right? And so there's a reason for that. Courts really don't want to be the parties that are quote unquote solving the problem, right? They want to encourage facilitative resolutions between parties that are separating or divorcing. Why? Because that's really not what the court needs to be doing. The court wants to simplify the process, make sure there's conversation and communication before they feel the pressures, of course, of having to say, well, hey, you know what, Nico? Unfortunately, I think that while you are going to have the joint legal capacity with your kids, mom should have the primary placement. Why? Because the kids are traditionally placed with mom more because of the nurturing factor, not because dads can't be nurturing. Of course, I've seen it on the other side. Dad receives all of the primary placement and mom is in the, what they call reasonable times upon reasonable notice scenario. So that's really the purpose. The court's purpose, especially in family law, they really don't want to be placed in that positional argumentative place, right?
So it seems like it's a more fair and balanced way of doing things rather than through the court itself.
I would call it, as far as fairness, it's probably the most fair by definition. Why? Because again, you're encouraging the parties to understand that they really have all of the marbles there in their bag, right, to solve this problem. You know, that always leads to conversations pertaining to emotional intelligence and emotional resilience, right? A lot of times the adversarial process is just something that people are kind of shying away from, not because they can't, but because they really shouldn't, right? Not everybody can communicate effectively, and we understand that as professionals, but it's not meant to be punitive as well, right? Because when you're trying to promote emotional resilience and emotional intelligence, really, I think those are areas that mediators really thrive and actually are experts in. So the emotional fluency in the conversation, because it's not positional, is really best facilitated through mediation.
I like that you bring up the emotional intelligence because that's where a lot of conflict comes from is not having the emotional intelligence or not having the understanding of what emotional intelligence is.
Yeah, you kind of hit it on the head there. Emotional intelligence, of course, and refers to the ability to recognize, understand, and manage the influence of emotions in oneself and others. So when you're talking about emotional intelligence in the context of mediation, emotional intelligence plays a crucial role in fostering those positive outcomes. For instance, individuals who are incarcerated or those maybe under community supervision when interacting with agents and agencies of the prison industrial complex, right? So those are areas that are extremely critical to practice emotional intelligence and resilience.
I'm going to switch topics for a moment because we had a conversation online a while ago on LinkedIn,
Mhm.
and generational trauma came up. And I wanted to know if you might touch on that a little bit and how that comes into play sometimes in your work.
Yeah, great question. Of course, generational trauma, and I think generational trauma applies across all spectrums of what we go through as we're maturing, right, as adults from childhood to adulthood. Using it in the context, even in business, a lot of times I'm faced with business owners that really aren't aware they're bringing in generational trauma into their business model, right? So when I'm working with veteran business outreach centers, I actually teach the legal component to what's called the Boots to Business program. It takes military service members transitioning from service into entrepreneurship. Traditionally, those conversations of generational trauma, people aren't recognizing the cues, right? In the Latino culture, for instance, of which I come from, we have a lot of what they call generational trauma, right? You've got the very die-hard nucleus of family values. Everybody knows everything that's going on in the families. From a business owner's perspective, you might bring some of that into conversations, how you're interacting with employees, maybe how you're envisioning the corporate culture is going to take hold, and what the mission, vision, and purpose of your company is going to be within a certain industry segment. When you have those traumatic experiences, for instance, maybe you didn't have a great relationship with your father, or maybe a grandparent was very important to you, passed early on in your childhood, and it really impacted you. Some of those elements come into play, and de escalating those conflicts, given generational trauma, can be very difficult for individuals to deal with. Why? Because, again, communication, it's not for everybody, right? It has to be practiced.
And again, we only know what we know. That's the one thing I think that when people get a better understanding, this is one thing about through education, no matter what your education is, if your education could be strictly from books, you never have to step into a university, but as we educate ourselves, we learn more about ourselves and things that have affected ourselves and others as we develop and grow into our adult human beings. And I don't know if we ever finish that process until we're 6 feet under.
Right. Yeah. Of course, the beauty of life is that it's lifelong learning in its process, right? So whether you're dealing and impacted in any event, resilience always carries that theme, right? And to your point, it never ends until the end comes. And so I think that's the beauty of life. It's the same thing whether, and you mentioned somebody that's educated because of life experiences, we'll call it the street cred, right? As opposed to the PhD that's over at Yale getting it all from a book. And in companies too, in those dynamics, especially when you're relating or talking about interpersonal relations that you're looking to build, I think it's always important, right? You have to pick up on the nonverbal cues. Body language comes into play, facial expressions come into play, tone of voice, right? Those all provide real critical insights into the emotional state of individuals, particularly valuable in settings where direct expression of emotions might be suppressed or misinterpreted, right? And that's almost always during a conversation involving conflict.
That's a good point because we all process things differently. What we see and what we hear may not be the same as what somebody else is experiencing. So we have to keep those things in mind when we talk to others. And body language is that's a huge thing. A lot of times someone say, "Oh yeah, I'm fine," but they've got their arms crossed. That protection wall is up. So there must be pros and cons of doing this work. Can you highlight a couple of each?
I'll start with maybe what the cons are. And I would think that the cons really come into play only by societal perception, right? I think there's an argument from the legal industry, more importantly, coming always from the side of an attorney that believes, well, the mediator is not an attorney. And actually, being a mediator myself, although I've got master's level education, but I'm not an actual attorney, I believe that it's actually quite difficult for an attorney to be in the position of mediator. So I would think that a lot of the cons come from the industry. For instance, even here in Wisconsin, a lot of times the argument is that someone would want an attorney to play the role of mediator or facilitator in a family court dispute. It's not the norm in other states, but I believe that there's a lot of that question mark, right? At what point does the mediator step into the realm ethically where legal advice might be coming into play? There again, the other con, right? Individuals need to understand that here as mediators, third party neutrals, facilitators, we're not here giving legal advice, right? Ultimately, what we're attempting to do is really facilitate a conversation and kind of take it in the direction where organically, based on those nonverbal cues that we had just discussed earlier, that we're really paying attention and that we're able to kind of dialogue towards a finality, right? The finality being a resolution that is beneficial to both parties. Why? Because ultimately they're recognizing the value in being the end all and be all. That being said, going to the pros. One, very much so the cost effectiveness of mediation, right? And I think it's important to always discuss the overall efficiency with which mediations are intended to move in. Traditionally, a mediator will operate on a either half day or full day mediation schedule. It's not to say that mediations don't go multiple days, but when you kind of have an expectancy of finality in conflict, a lot of times I see family members and individuals that are involved in that really appreciative of the fact that you've kind of given a timeline in a very finite way, right? Because we're creatures of habits being human. We like to know kind of what's going to happen in advance. And I think that that really lends to the pros, leading again to the pros of cost approach. With mediations, traditionally, you're going to have a cost that's almost 30, maybe to 35% less than a traditional litigious action billable hour wise through an attorney or a law firm. So standard attorneys, I think right now we're hovering in that $500 to $600 per hour billable range, where with conflict resolution and dispute resolution, you're really hovering there in the, 275, $350 range, which is a lot more palatable when you're talking that it's collaborative. And so that investment, I don't call it costs in the space that I operate in, but that investment is traditionally shared, and so it becomes a balance act, right? Why? Because if I'm going through marital dispute, and actually I've been through it myself, the process, you know, we understand having gone through divorces or separations, parenting issues. There's always going to be, when you're thinking litigious and argumentation, you're thinking it's a cost. Holy cow, this is, look at what I'm about to spend, and I could have gone and done XYZ, something different with that money. But when it's mediation, a lot of times, kind of to my point where I mentioned it's an investment, people really take ownership of that. It's an emotional tie, right? They're thinking, my goodness, much like I would invest in my college education, right? Or in the college education of my children, this is something that's really going to be impactful, right? And it's really meant to engage in finding the solution before I even have to think of expending a cost to, going and fighting mom or fighting dad in a court of law. So I think those would be really a lot of the pros and cons. Of course, there's more pros than cons, in my opinion, into the mediation space. Why? Because people are being heard, right? They're not being suppressed. A lot of time, agents and agencies of the criminal justice system, a lot of people feel they're suppressed in their voices, right? Why? Because here I am, I'm sitting down in a courtroom, and I have the person next to me that's representing my interest, the attorney, who's going to speak for me. If I speak out of that kind of limitation, I'm being admonished by someone on a bench. It can be very intimidating, right? To see a judge and a court reporter, the clerks all operating. Of course, you've got law enforcement in the room for purposes of keeping and maintaining the peace. Those types of environments can be extremely difficult for someone who's never maybe experienced the criminal justice system or even a courtroom before. It becomes very, very much so suppression, right? Where with mediation, it's an inviting environment. Oftentimes I invite clients and individuals to come into my office for these mediations. And of course, now the new cat's meow is virtual mediation, right? Why? Because mediators have realized that sometimes the most comfortable space to have a conversation is in a person's own home, right? Where they feel like they can exert a little bit of control or they're just feeling comfortable. You can conduct a mediation with someone virtually in the comfort of their homes. If they wanted to be in pajamas, so be it, right? Whatever is going to encourage the conversation to be meaningful and the voices are not suppressed. Certainly, you've got mediations and scenarios where individuals become so boisterous, it's so discombobulated, right? Where people are raising the pitch of their voice, the tone, it becomes more almost attack directly at the person or party. Again, this is why you have a facilitator, right? To make certain that those things do not happen. And we have baseline rules, of course, with how the mediation is going to be handled. And that's why you would use a facilitator.
So, do you use restorative justice practices?
Yes, especially in the context of mediation, alternative dispute resolution within the criminal justice systems, right? We have to understand, what is it about the prison industrial complex that makes it so complex, right? First and foremost, if you're an advocate of reform, you're attempting to break the cycle of any negative responses that incarcerated individuals or their families on the outside are experiencing, right? Traditionally, you're experiencing those moments when you're on the outside, feeling the pain of the individual on the inside. Why? Because it's a perceived injustice within the system itself, right? We have to correct that narrative. And I believe when you're promoting long-term change within the prison industrial complex or the criminal justice system, we really have to promote it thinking long-term behavioral changes, right? So restorative justice promotes that, right? The individual who was the victim or was victimized in a crime, for instance, and the individual that might have perpetuated it. We bring those individuals through restorative justice mechanisms to talk to one another, engage in a conversation. And that's kind of where you see those long-term behavioral changes, the breaking of the cycles of negative responses really taking foothold, right? Why? Because it's not that the person never thought that they could forgive, let's just say, an individual that might have perpetuated a crime against them, but it sparks a conversation for maybe the perspectives, right? To encourage the other side to see the other side. Does that make sense? And so, you're reducing the enablement of the suppression of constructive feedback that traditionally is formative given the dynamics of the prison industrial complex and what most individuals would believe is the mandate, right? Ultimately, people perceive it to be an environment that is intent upon diminishing an individual's worth, devaluing an individual's independence, and therefore, in effect, making the individual understand that through the system of suppression, they are less than someone that is actually on the other side of that fence and outside.
I had a My brain's bouncing around here. I just had a question come to mind. Have you ever had a situation where you've been involved with some type of conflict resolution between somebody who is incarcerated and somebody who works in the prison?
So, yes. um, you know, first and foremost, the real issue becomes the punitive measures, right, that we're attempting to mitigate in that capacity. We all know, and in fact, maybe some of the listeners don't know, in prison systems, we have punitive measures that are meant to provide, we'll call it the prison industrial complex's version of resolutions when incarcerated individuals have conflict with guards or correctional staff or even agents of the system. What happens here? Well, emotional intelligence and resilience are not applied. Why? Because the system is not trained in that normally. Had we thought about this, and especially the narrative, it's so important to make sure the listeners here understand this. The purpose here is to decrease punitive measures impacting on both sides because the punitive measures impact both the agent, aka the correctional officer, or maybe the administrative staff when they're coming in to have the administrative hearing for what's known as conduct report hearings, right? It's an administrative function within prison settings to discuss and then find punitive measures on how they're going to solve a conflict between staff and incarcerated individual. Of course, the incarcerated individual is left without representation, meaning the voice is suppressed. And it's meant to be that way. They do have what are known as advocates on the inside. Mainly in the federal system, the advocates are actually trained inmates, right? Individuals that have gone through some manner of training. But frankly, in state prison systems, Wisconsin is one of them, you do not have an inmate to inmate advocate. In fact, under the rules here, it's prohibited. What they do is they place, interesting enough, another individual who is representative of the prison industrial complex as the inmate advocate. Now, how is that even possible, right? Someone would sit here thinking, how am I reconciling that if I'm an individual and I'm shackled head to toe, I'm being wheelchaired into an administrative punitive hearing, and the intent here is right to have information presented as to why I should receive more punitive measures against me. I'm already maybe in segregation, and now I have not only a representation by 1 to 3 individuals who are the quote unquote administrative hearing officers. In order to voice my interest, I have an agent of the system who's supposed to speak some way, somehow, not only intelligently about me, but also advocate for me. One would understand that doesn't reconcile, right, in the resolution process. So what do we need to do? We need to apply mediators in these systems. We need to bring in trained individuals who can mandate oversight, one, two, incorporate emotional intelligence and resilience into that process, right? In other words, maybe even having civilian oversight, taxpayers who are, mind you, contributing to the prison industrial complex in and of itself. Quite frankly, I think the solution would be to place measures like that into the system, right? And address it that way. Why? Because at the end of the day, the individual that's shackled head to toe really is not being heard. They don't really have a voice. Some people will say, Nico, prison is supposed to not be some cozy, rosy place, right, for somebody to land. But there again, that would be the lack of emotional intelligence and resilience coming from society where those societal norms are no longer there anymore, right? People understand, for one, if you're a taxpayer like we are, any concept that the prison system is receiving more funding and money over the education system for our children, in and of itself is very peculiar, right, to reconcile. Two, We need oversight. Okay. Mediation provides that powerful alternative to punitive measures. For instance, even like revocation, or if you're in an administrative hearing while you're incarcerated, extended incarceration. Why? Because a lot of the punitive measures within those systems for administrative hearings literally allow for the prison industrial complex to add on time to an individual sentence structure, right? Without going and having the due process of a traditional legal criminal justice hearing. So we have to remind ourselves why this approach in reducing punitive measures has done so by 25 to 40% in some jurisdictions that, to your point at the very beginning of this conversation, implement restorative justice and mediation practices to begin with, right? So it's a big ball of wax, if you will.
Well, I would think that would also reduce recidivism rates because people learn how to deal with conflict in a better way.
100%. Listen, from the reduction in recidivism, and I'm glad that you brought this up, one of the big things that is fostered by emotional intelligence and emotional resilience initiatives is that people begin to recognize what's driving their behavior. When you foster that self awareness and emotional control, incarcerated individuals can make better choices, right? That leads to those lower rates of recidivism that you're speaking of. In fact, there's a study out there, the Council of State Governments Justice Center literally put out a study that stated individuals who participated in emotional intelligence training during incarceration or during their supervision were 30% less likely to reoffend compared to those individuals who did not. So, once again, mediation, guiding the emotional intelligence, assist individuals in rebuilding those relationships. And don't forget, what are the relationships when people are coming out? Immediately you're dealing and faced with parole and probation officers. You're dealing with other agents, are not normally predicated upon respecting and understanding one another, right? It's once again that thumb down on the individual, right? The suppression of the voices that basically creates a power imbalance, if you will, right? They're telling you why you have to respect them. If you don't, guess where you're headed? Well, you're headed right back to prison, or you're headed to what they call a quasi-investigation time frame. 21 days for you to sit inside a 7 by 9 cell to think about why you shouldn't think to tell me as your probation or parole agent why you might have an opinion. These are all issues that people don't want to talk about but need to be talked about, especially when you're talking how we're going to better combat recidivism rates, decarceration initiatives, impact to communities, right? These are all extremely important strategies, rather, to build better relationships between parolees, their agents, leading to a higher success rate of reintegration as opposed to how can we make sure the success rate is built upon compliance and on top of that punitive compliance.
Right. I've always thought that if probation had something to offer, now, whether or not it be a class, I've even thought about going up and saying, hey, I'll do a class and teach these guys how to do podcasts. Give them something to do in their spare time, right? And it would also give them a better reason for going to probation, and they would be learning a skill. And I'm really surprised at the way things is, it's like 9 out of 10 times it seems like they're trying to trip them up. That's not really what's going on. I understand that, but it does seem like that probation and parole should be more supportive services than punitive services.
Well, what are we really experiencing in the area of the criminal justice system and the departments of not corrections, but now we're kind of walking into the departments of community supervision? What are we really seeing out there? Well, first and foremost, the bad word that nobody wants to talk about in the system, we have agents and agencies that have burnout, right? Emotional resilience is just as important for agents of the prison industrial complex, such as parole officers, correctional staff, community supervision agents. Why? Because these individuals are oftentimes experiencing even higher levels of stress and burnout due to the nature of their work. I mean, imagine walking into a building and talking to hundreds of people a week, thousands of people a year that you already believe are against you, right? Or the stress of believing that here you're in a profession that mandates for you to maybe set aside some of your traditional principles, what I call the humanity effect, right? In exchange for punitive processes that you're actually wielding, believing that you have that ultimate power and authority. Burnout and stress in that line of work is much like law enforcement traditionally, and mediation processes would be incorporated to a system to be resilient, right? Helping agents stay focused in their work. How to avoid a lot of that emotional overreaction, for instance, if you're hearing something coming from the other side, the formerly incarcerated individual, and as opposed to becoming punitive and reactionary or judgmental, engaging in what's known as a fair and balanced decision making process, right? So these are all things that should be implemented. We understand. I would like to see, as opposed to the conversation, for instance, of why agents and agencies require a higher wage or maybe more money, right, in their hourly potential to earn. I would have liked to have seen more funding towards correctional associations engaging in that type of training, right? Emotional intelligence and emotional resilience. Why? Because ultimately, it allows everybody to cope with the stresses of incarceration and supervision. Incarcerated individuals that are entering community supervision are already facing significant stressors, right? The stressor of isolation. Not a lot of people are going to do well if you're placed in a 7 by 9, a 6 by 5 concrete space, right? With limited water, limited resources as far as the concept of one roll of toilet paper, for instance, or on a certain schedule. And by the way, what's on the tray is what's there for the day. You've got the trauma about the uncertainty of your future when you're coming out. Okay. And we know that community correctional systems that are really meant and mandated to prepare people for transition from being incarcerated. So when you're working down from a supermax max level to a medium secured detention facility to a less restrictive environment and then to community work while you're incarcerated, people will still have the uncertainty about their future there, right? And the system is not really doing too well in preparing people, moving away from, the traditional roles that incarcerated individuals are playing, custodial, janitorial, right? As opposed to maybe trending more towards engaging individuals in trades, right? And really prepping them, to your point, learning a skill set.
Recently really been thinking about this because I've been working with a couple of groups that do dog programs. And why not take that last 2 years of incarceration and have it be trade schools? We are desperate for tradespeople right now, plumbers and HVAC people, and they're good paying jobs for when people come home. And it just is. It doesn't make sense to have so much downtime. It just doesn't. There's could be so much happening to improve the lives of everybody. The people that are coming home, in their communities, their families, and even the people who aren't coming home. Programming inside is still good because you have jobs like hospice workers and, people that can do peer support, and there's a lot of things that can still be done within the prison walls.
Yeah, a lot of times I kind of use a few stories. I pastor and I minister to impacted communities through an organization called Breaking the Chains Church. It's actually the newest church here in the Lutheran Synod in Wisconsin. And you see the imbalances, right, from individuals that actually have some training education, come out, they perform better, as opposed to individuals that, to your point, have nothing but downtime and are not receiving that encouragement. One of the big issues here is, I try to tell people these are not individuals that are prisoners or felons that then became professionals, okay? These are professionals that unfortunately had to experience incarceration or an event such as being impacted. I use Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart didn't walk in to her criminal trial for fraud, being called a fraudster and believing that she was a fraudster, okay? When she was convicted by the jury of her peers. So, Martha Stewart, with regard to what happened with her, she never walked in, even after being convicted. She didn't walk into federal prison believing she was anything less than a professional, right? And a lot of times, correcting these narratives are very important. People have to understand their value and their worth. But when you're coming from a system that's constantly telling you you're devalued, it's very difficult. And again, hence the importance of making certain that emotional intelligence and emotional resilience components are really there for everyone, agents and agencies, as well as incarcerated, impacted individuals and their families alike.
That's a great point to make. And we need to reduce the stigma. I've been doing this work for a very long time. I haven't quite figured out how to do that other than representing people instead of as labels.
Yeah, I think, and again, I feel very strongly about this. The only way that individuals will overcome their view of stigmas is ultimately to correct their own narratives, right? You have to be empowered to control your own narrative, and incorporating emotional intelligence and resilience into your mindset really allows individuals to constructively not only reduce conflict, but move towards positive outcomes within themselves. I think it's very important for someone to always remind themselves that regardless of circumstances, regardless of how society might want to cast the stones, we're all perfectly imperfect. And it's just so important. I try to tell people in pastoral times, how can one expect grace if you're unwilling to give it to somebody else, right? So I think in that vein and train of thought, it's just so important to always remind yourself you are enough, you're worth everything. I know sometimes it's difficult for people to think that way, but fostering the emotional intelligence and resilience model, I think will move towards a criminal justice system that truly values rehabilitation and restorative practices over those punitive measures that we discussed earlier on.
That's really good. I think that's probably a good place to wrap things up. Although, I do have one more question for you, and this is my question I ask everybody. I am a firm believer in reading, and I noticed on your LinkedIn page you have a bunch of books behind you. Is there a book that's made a real important influence in your life?
Wow. Um, you know, I'm an avid reader. My mom is a retired educator, and one thing she always had us do as kids was read. Back when they had the Reading is Fundamental program across the country, RIF. One of the most important books in my life actually has always been The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. I probably have about 12 iterations and versions of this book. The reason why it was so impactful to me, when you think of Edmond Dantes as the character, right? Someone that was falsely accused, brought into a prison, the Chateau d'If, spent years there. What were some of the things that Edmond Dantes had done, though? He was taught, right, by a mentor, somebody that had taken him under their wing, the abbé, right, the priest that was also incarcerated with him. And that's where he learned linguistics, the art of etiquette, all these things. he spent that time certainly also, though, plotting and planning what he was going to do when he got out, if he ever got out. But it's not so much the plotting and planning, it's a story of hope, right? It's a story of emotional intelligence and emotional resilience. By the time Edmond Dantes comes out of the Chateau d'If, takes on the personification of the Count of Monte Cristo, begins to become the oppressor, right? Towards the individuals that had wronged him. Only at the end, of course, to, out of love for someone, was able to overcome that anger, frustration, maybe we'll call it even a little bit of hatred. And the story ends, of course, with a brilliant conclusion that ultimately shows the power of love and resilience when it's implemented the right way. So, yeah, the Count of Monte Cristo, always have loved it. And if nobody's read it, or if you're looking for a book to refresh, I would recommend it.
I have not read it, and I'm going to have to look at up now. One more question. Was there a website or any information you wanted to share before we wrap things up?
Certainly, yeah. I think when someone is looking to engage with mediators, much like the Bar Association, of course, I'm on the platform of mediate.com. Mediate.com is where you'll find an abundance of information. And so I would encourage individuals seeking a mediator to always visit mediate.com as a platform. Take a look at some of the resources there. Again, they're in abundance and it's, international. So the neat thing is that no matter where you're located, you type in the information, city, state, zip, or even just a country, a location, it'll pull up a list of mediators in your area. If you're in Wisconsin, and in the Milwaukee market, I'm on there as well as a senior mediator myself. So always use that platform as an initial inquiry. Of course, you can also go and find family support and advocacy workshops. I, again, do a lot of facilitative work through the neurodivergent autistic space. So supporting organizations like Autism Speaks, right, and the Autism Society, I highly recommend that as well.
That's great. Thank you so much. I want to remind our listeners that we've had Nico Cuevas Quiles with us in the studio today. I really appreciate him taking time out and sharing all kinds of information, but mainly on the alternative dispute resolution. Again, thank you, Nico.
Thanks so much for having me, Valerie. It's been a pleasure.